Listen to this quote from Tim Keller. He said, "Secularism, the view that there is no God, gives you a concept of identity that is extremely fragile. Every religion says that you find who you are by connecting with someone that is, or something that is more important than you."
Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. It's a ministry of Dr. Douglas Peake. It's designed to coach you up in your faith by giving you access to biblical insight, scholarship, and ministry experience of Dr. Peake that spans 38 years. Unlike most pastors, Dr. Peake has a unique and refreshing approach. He wants you to grow in your own faith by learning to think for yourself. The implication is he's not here to tell you what to think, what to wear, what music to listen to, who to vote for, or what diet to follow. You need to make these decisions for yourself. His goal is to coach you. This means you have to do the work. You are the only one who can make your faith grow, and Dr. Peake is just here to give you the tools to do it. So stop listening to people telling you what to think and make up your own mind. Join the fastest growing movement in today's world, people who think for themselves and take their faith seriously. Here's the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peake.
Hey, welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you are a part of the Salty Pastor podcast and you're joining us as we dig into some of the deeper things of life that have incredibly practical application for the type of life that you live and your perception of how good your life is and can be. You know, I'm here to help you develop skills and tools that are necessary for navigating this world. One of the things I want you to do is I want you to be able to clarify what you believe and why you believe it. Because I often say what you believe is one of the most important things about you that make you who you are, the you that is you. The other thing is that I want you to be able to develop critical thinking skills. You know, when you learn logic and how logic works, rhetoric, and how people make arguments, and then how they support their arguments, once you learn those basic skills, it becomes incredibly difficult for you to be manipulated, deceived, or coerced. And that's a really important sense of strength that you develop in yourself. It helps you discern truth from falsehood. You know, these are all skills that you can develop. It doesn't matter whether you are just starting out or you're a seasoned vet. They are all skills that make a huge difference in your life as you learn to grow your faith. And I'm here to help coach you up in that. So I'm glad you're with us and I'm glad you're here. It's been an exciting time, what we are digging into right now. And I think it's just going to make a huge difference for you.
Absolutely. And our focus right now is on identity and why you should think deeply about your own sense of self. On Tuesday's podcast, you stated that a healthy identity is the context in which we experience all good things in life. In essence, your identity determines what type of life you live and how you perceive or experience your life. So here's my first question for today's discussion. Why has it become so difficult in our society to develop a healthy identity?
Well, I think in a nutshell, it's because we threw out faith or religion in our society and we tried to become secular completely in the way we want to structure society. You know, it's interesting. It reminds me of a story. My father was a pediatric endocrinologist, and he graduated med school, I think, in 1963. And then he did a internship for a year. And then he went to the Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. And there he started his craft as a pediatric endocrinologist. And he told me that when he started out as a research doctor, the pituitary gland in the brain was considered to be very similar to your appendix, right? It had very little function, and in a way, you could take it out and it wouldn't make any difference. And he said, towards the end, right before he passed away, he said, now we know it's the most important gland in the brain because it regulates all the other glands that release hormones in your body. And so our society has mistakenly believed it could throw out religion, just like those early doctors thought they could get rid of the pituitary gland, without realizing what religion or faith actually does. And most particularly what Christianity does for human beings and for societies. to some effect, this is true across the board. To some effect, all religions, okay, are built on a belief of what it means to be a human being. Even secular humanism, atheism, scientific materialism, or naturalism is built on a definition of what it means to be a human being. Okay. And what's really interesting is your identity is always built around your humanity. So if your definition of what it means to be a human being is skewed or off base, then your identity will be skewed and off base. That's why in Christianity, a relationship with Jesus always starts with salvation. That's why he says you must be born again. You have become a new creation. Paul tells us in Ephesians, you were once strangers and aliens. No more, you are adopted, fellow citizens. So you see, all of these terms are referencing your change in identity when you experience salvation in Jesus Christ. And that's why Christianity is all about starting with this change in identity that they call salvation. So, the greatest thing you can do, even if you're not a believer, that's going to impact your life is to develop a healthy identity. And if you are a follower of Christ, the number one goal of a person of faith, person following Jesus, should be to grow a healthy identity. However, I think it's getting more difficult to do that in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of leads me to my next question. Like, how does a secular society undermine our development of a healthy identity?
Well, that's a big question. But I think that we need to talk about some trends and some really big upstream ideas real quick. But I think it's going to resonate with people who are listening to this and who want to figure out, how in the world do I work on my identity and develop a new, healthier identity? And so you got to realize the challenges that people are facing in society today and why it's becoming more difficult to actually achieve that goal of discovering and developing a new healthy identity. Well, number one is the intentional undermining of the nuclear family. I mean, this has been intentional. A strong nuclear family is how children develop identity. The family, if it becomes undermined, then identity is poorly formed. This was the entire point behind Marxism's desire to eradicate the nuclear family. He particularly said that the nuclear family was a threat to his communist utopia. He believed that the nuclear family produced humans independent of the state, and he had to eradicate it in order for people to identify as a collective person, not an individual person. So today, the nuclear family is really struggling because in America, we've adopted a lot of socialist policies. And what these policies end up doing is undermining the nuclear family. In America today, less than half of children are growing up in a traditional nuclear family. Only 46%, according to Pew Research Center. To me, that's just absolutely astounding that the majority of children in America today are not growing up in a traditional nuclear family. The direct result of this is poorly formed identity, right? And that, boy, it plays out all across the board in how these people grow up and then perceive their lives and perceive whether their lives are good or are they bad. The more children that grow up in fatherless homes, the more adults we're going to have that struggle with a healthy identity, how to find or discover one. And the research is clear. The greatest crisis facing the future of America is fatherless children. If you grew up this way and you grew up without a father, then you know exactly what I'm talking about, is that you might look back and or you might evaluate yourself. Let me put it this way, and think to yourself, wow, why is it that at times I lack confidence, or why is it that I lack focus sometimes? Why is it that sometimes I'll do the pleasurable thing instead of the hard thing, right? Why am I not as disciplined as I want? Or why do I work so hard to, and do so much and it never seems to be enough?
Mm.
When you have these tendencies inside of you, it's because you're struggling with your identity, right? Deep down inside, that self-perception of who you think you really are. And so if you grew up this way, though, the promise of knowing Jesus is that you can overcome those challenges, uh, because Jesus is all about giving you a new identity. And so he is 100% in the redemption business. And so
Right.
what he can do is he can help you focus on, understand, and embrace this new identity, even though you grew up in a society that, in essence, kind of stole it from you by undermining the nuclear family and basically propagating the idea, hey, it's okay if you don't want to stay married or if you want to move on because kids are so resilient, they always bounce back. Well, guess what all the research is telling us today? That's just not true, right?
Mm.
I mean, we have generations of adults now who've grown up and they have all kinds of mental health issues. And a lot of it's traced back to the fact that they grew up in fatherless homes. Now, the second major upstream idea I think that's really hindering us from having healthy identities and discover them is our educational system. And I don't mean just public government run schools, I mean private ones as well. You see, the majority of them adopted a secularist view of human identity. In my book, The Future of American Education, I point out that the reason outcomes are so low in America today is not because of improper educational techniques. It's not because of underskilled teachers or poorly trained teachers. It's not due to parents and their desire to have kids get educated. It all comes down to this: we've adopted a secular definition of human identity. And because we've done that, now we have all these downstream implications of that simple shift in how we perceive human beings. And the shift has now become, because we've shifted this way, the emphasis now becomes that we need to develop healthy identities apart from competency, right? That's why schools give participation trophies, right? The emphasis is on developing identities apart from family, and that is that oftentimes schools are trained to see parents and families as the problem, not the solution. Well, in some cases, you can say that that's true. If your family, let's say your parents have drug addictions and it's toxic and there's child abuse and violence, well, of course, that's a toxic situation. But what has happened is that in our public education system, in an attempt to develop new identities apart from family, it's alienating more and more people with healthy families. And so I just find that a fascinating shift, and the implications are showing up in the outcomes. The number one factor in educational outcomes is family involvement,
Mm.
right? So I think it's really important to understand how this shift in identity is influencing the educational system today. The third, and this is where it gets really dicey, but I think it's very important to understand, is that our culture has written into law the idea that you have a right to define your own identity, and it's society's responsibility to affirm that.
Mm.
This is a radical shift in jurisprudence. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from the majority opinion in the Obergefell decision back in 2015, 2016, where the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples have the same right to marriage that heterosexual couples do. Okay, well, that was the decision, and that was rolled out. What's really interesting is in jurisprudence, the reason for the decision is critical. And listen to one of the things that Justice Kennedy wrote when he wrote the majority opinion. He said, the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons within a lawful realm to define and express their identity. And so what he said is that the reason why we're expanding this right is because people have a right to define their own identity and express that identity. And therefore, society has a responsibility to affirm that and allow them to do that. And the result of this now is why you have libraries who host drag queen story hours. This is why you have major businesses like Budweiser and Fred Meyer and Albertsons supporting during Pride Month drag queen parades where they actually bring children to them and expose them to all sorts of things. I know a lot of buddies who are cops and they have to work these things, and they just talk about how lascivious it is, the way the people in these parades dress and what the all the suggestive moves that they do, and that people are bringing their children to watch this. Why? Well, because from a societal standpoint, this is how these people define their identity, and we're required to affirm that in some form or another. What I find really interesting is how come there's never a drag queen story hour at the assisted care facility? Why isn't there a drag queen story hour at the NRA men's groups, right? Or the NRA training facilities or training events? Why isn't it why is it that the only time we have drag queen story hour it's for kids? I find that really interesting. Another thing that I think is important to understand, because of the legal basis for this law, this is why gender ideology can be presented to children in elementary school, right? And so, I read this book by Carl Trueman. It's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And it's called Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to the Sexual Revolution. And what's really interesting is he talks about what era we're in today, and he explains how we got to this place, and it's really interesting that he starts the book off by simply saying this, that if he would have told his grandpa that a guy made the statement, "I am a woman," his grandpa would have just laughed because it would have been so absurd. And yet today, that's an acceptable identity by which you can define yourself, and society is required to affirm that. So this whole notion of the expressive self is an attempt to affirm all of these identities. And here's what's sad about it, okay? If your identity requires another person to affirm it, then you don't have a healthy identity. If your identity requires another person to affirm it, then you don't have a healthy identity. You have a codependent identity. And that's going to hurt you more than anybody else. The role of a free society is to allow you to pursue life, liberty, and your definition of happiness. In doing so, you cannot trample on the freedoms of others. But today, this has changed into the role of society now is to affirm all of these alternative identities, right? Whatever you choose to be. And what's happening is it's producing a fragile citizenry. Listen to this quote from Tim Keller. He said, "Secularism, the view that there is no God, gives you a concept of identity that is extremely fragile. Every religion says that you find who you are by connecting with someone that is or something that is more important than you. Secular culture says that you find who you are by discovering what you really want or desire, pursuing that at all costs, and asserting it over everyone else." Now, lots of research has shown that that kind of identity, which is really unique throughout all human history, makes you incredibly fragile, simply because you desperately need the affirmation, the kind of recognition that they can actually that can actually end up enslaving you. Isn't that interesting? You notice how he says that. Lots of research has shown that that type of identity, which is really unique throughout all human history, is incredibly fragile, because what it does is it enslaves you because you desperately need the affirmation, the recognition of other people. So because of these trends, I think in society, we're seeing the downstream impact of them. every single day. And it impacts people on an individual level, and it undermines their healthy identity. So, in a sense, you could say our society is at the point where people have become so fragile that we're committing societal suicide.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. Why does this ideology cause a nation to commit? Like, how are you getting there? I guess is my question. This idea of societal suicide.
Well, what happens is, like Tim Keller said, is that people become more enslaved to the need for acceptance. And what was really interesting in the rise of fascism in the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, right? What happened is they created a group called the Secret Police, known as the Gestapo. And the whole point of the Gestapo was to see how pure your ideology, were you pure in your ideology? So basically, what happens is everybody has to think and act the same. Otherwise, they're immediately punished. And
Right.
fascism isn't just like people say, well, Nazism and fascism is a right wing thing. I go, well, the exact same thing happened on the far left in communist Russia. There's a story during Stalin's reign where a person, some family member or somebody close to Stalin, did a concert, right? And after the concert, the recital, the whole crowd stood up and started clapping, and everybody just kept clapping and clapping and clapping because nobody wanted to be the first to stop clapping.
Mm.
Well, after this incredibly long 45 minutes of clapping, one person said, "This is absolutely ridiculous," and
Right.
stopped clapping and sat down. Everybody else immediately stopped clapping and sat down. You know what happened? The Russian secret police, KGB, arrested that man and sent him to a gulag. So
Mm.
this is fascinating. You see, you become enslaved to what everybody else thinks. Then George Orwell's Animal Farm becomes the rule of the day. It's oppressive
Right.
across the board, and that destroys a society. The other way is it destroys it because it makes it economically unsustainable. You see, this shift in ideology, I don't think people realize, is what is influencing our nation's inability to manage itself fiscally. Tocqueville once said this. I believe it was Tocqueville who said this. He stated that once the citizenry realizes it can vote its hand into the public treasury, it's going to collapse. Well, today, the federal government, I don't think people realize this, the federal government brings in just over $3.2 trillion in tax revenue. $1 trillion every year is spent on interest on the federal debt. Okay.
Mm.
Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those three welfare programs, over $1 trillion a year is spent on just those three programs. So very little is left for everything else: our military, our educational system, all the other programs. And what a lot of people don't realize is that doesn't matter because our current government is adding $1 trillion of debt to our national debt every 100 days. That's over $3 trillion a year.
Mm.
That is what is causing inflation right now, more than anything else, is overspending. It's not interest rates. It's the fact that our government is printing money like crazy and spending it. And so inflation is going to always be bad until they bring all that spending back into reason. But guess what? Nobody can get elected by cutting spending.
Mm.
And that's why a society ends up committing suicide.
So I want to circle back around now. You stated a healthy identity is the key to the type of life a person will live. Christianity starts with salvation, which is going to give a new identity from Jesus on a born again follower, right? So however we live in a world where there are so many competing ideologies, it's getting harder and harder for the average person to navigate the challenge of discovering and developing a new identity. So let's just talk practical steps, Pastor. What can they do right now if they want to develop a healthier identity?
Well, the first thing I'd say, if you're a listener to the Salty Pastor podcast and you're not a follower of Jesus yet, I would ask you to do some research and before you make a decision or whether or not you're going to follow him. And that is what type or what are all the qualities of the new identity Jesus promises to give me if I choose to follow him, right? And I think that's a really great thing is that what does he actually say he will bestow upon me? And you can find answers to this really quite easily in the New Testament. And so go and ask somebody, do a little research, Google it, do some reading, and find out what kind of identity does Jesus, if he's real and he's risen from the dead, would bestow upon you. Number two, I would say if you're a follower of Christ, then you should take out a piece of paper or maybe on your phone or however, you do it and start a list. And what I would do is I would start making identity statements or recording words that reflect your identity of how you perceive yourself. So start thinking of words that describe who you believe yourself to be. Are you kind? Are you compassionate? Are you focused? Are you disciplined? Are you, what do you care about? Do you care about the truth? Do you care about speaking your mind? Or do you care about being nice to people even when they don't deserve it? Are you very forgiving? Are you, you just start thinking of all the different kinds of words that might describe you as a person that you believe are true. And then I would start another list and start thinking about your nature, right? Evaluate what you think your nature is like. Ask yourself basic questions like, what is it that I like about myself or don't like about myself? And oftentimes the things we don't like about ourselves come from our nature, not from our identity. Ask yourself the question Paul posed there in Romans. I think it's chapter 7. He goes, why do I do the things that I do? Right? I don't do the things I want to do. I end up doing the things I hate. He goes, who will deliver me from this wretched body of death? So he goes, I'm so confused. And what he's talking about is his nature. You see, why does his nature influence him so much and cause him to do the things that he hates and doesn't want to do, as opposed to doing the things that he does want to do and the things he loves? Well, we're all in that same struggle. Right. And so your question is, until you really think about your nature and how it influences you, and you think about your identity and how it influences you, it's really difficult to start developing and growing a healthy identity. So I would ask myself, the final question I would ask myself is this: what kind of person do I believe I can become? What does a new me actually look like? Right. And what do I look like if all of those things I don't like about myself are gone? And so I think that's an important thing, because then you start to see how Jesus helps you, influences you, grows you, matures you. And that's what the Salty Pastor podcast is all about. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm trying to say, try these things, focus on developing these skills, turn your attention, turn your focus to these things. And I think what you're going to find is that they have an incredible transformational aspect on the life that you're living right now. And that's what this is all about, is to help you develop the beliefs and the skills and the faith to become the person that Christ has called you to become. And in that process, you're going to find how much more courageous and confident and centered and at peace you are. You're going to see the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, mercy, just naturally start flowing out of your life. And that, as your salty pastor, is what I hope happens to you.
Well, I want to wrap up with kind of my takeaways from our discussion today. And the first one being kind of like this key to living life is by thinking deeply about our identity, not just passively thinking about it, not even just like glancing over and say, yeah, I know what it is, but really understanding and thinking deeply about who I am. Our identity is the sense of who we are as a person. And in our world today, this is a challenge because all of the other things that are trying to tell us what our identity is and tell us that we need to rely on them to tell us our identity. But Jesus actually gives us the tools to do it on our own and have a solid, rock steady foundation for an identity. So make sure you guys visit the website. If you like what you're hearing, what you're seeing in this podcast, make sure you visit our website. You can learn more about other episodes that cover different topics. We have a whole database that shows that. You can go to YouTube and like and subscribe. That helps us build the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have thoughts about anything we're talking about. And finally, if you believe in what we're doing, you can go to the saltypastor.com website and donate. Help us grow this ministry into a bigger, more powerful movement across the nation. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week here on the Salty Pastor Podcast.
Hey, blessings on you, everyone, and keep thinking for yourself.